In the last episode of the $100 Flip-Up Challenge, I had an abundance of components after selling a solid system featuring a Ryzen 7 3700X and an RTX 3070. Along with these parts, I have just over $545 to put towards any additional purchases needed to complete 2 full gaming PCs for this episode. I decided to keep the RTX 4060 and the 4K 60 Pro capture card that came with the trade from the previous episode. After that, I gave the remaining components a well-deserved cleaning, preparing them to be repurposed in this episode. To start on one of the builds, I wanted to incorporate the 1070 Ti that I recently did a video on. A friend of mine actually found this GPU in a dumpster a few months ago, and he sold it to me for just $60. It's an EVGA ultra-silent FTW model, and despite a few noticeable scratches on the shroud and backplate, it still looks great. Even in 2024, the 1070 Ti holds its own in 1080p gaming, capable of handling nearly anything you throw at it. It's impressive how well some of the higher-end Pascal cards have held up after 7 or 8 years. For this build, I thought pairing the card with an AM4 platform and most of the parts I received in that recent trade would work well. However, I decided to upgrade from the first-gen Ryzen 5 1600. I originally aimed for a Ryzen 5 3600, but ultimately found a Ryzen 5 3500X for just $42 on eBay. This is a lesser known Zen 2 chip that was mainly sold in China or in OEM systems. It has 6 cores and 6 threads with a base clock of 3.6 GHz that boosts up to 4.1 GHz. The main drawback of the 3500X is its lack of hyperthreading, but for most games it should perform well. With both the CPU and GPU ready, I had everything needed to complete our first build for today. I decided to swap in the red Corsair LPX RAM that I picked up a few episodes back since it matched the red accents on the motherboard. Overall, this build specs are a pretty big step down from the PC I completed last time, but I'm confident it'll easily sell locally for a decent amount. For the second build, I used the i7 7700K paired with the Asus GTX 1070 and most of the other leftover parts from the big parts haul in episode 4. While the 7700K is starting to show its age as a 4-core 8-threaded chip from 2017, it should still be quite capable when paired with the era-appropriate GTX 1070, especially in the right use case. Since I already had the ASRock B250 Pro 4 motherboard and Corsair 550W power supply, I only needed a few more parts to finish the system. First, I ordered a new Zalman Z1 Iceberg for $53 on Newegg. This compact MATX case has minimal front air intake for my tastes, but it does come with 3 120mm fans and a magnetic, swiveling tempered glass side panel, so managing higher temps if needed shouldn't be too difficult. On Amazon, I picked up a Patriot P3 Gen 3 512GB NVMe SSD drive for just over $33. This slots right into the M.2 port and should provide a solid start for downloading a few games. During assembly, I ran into an issue with the CPU cooler. The fan was blocked by the RAM. I ended up adjusting the configuration so the fan faces backward, pulling air in from the rear. In most photos, you see the rear exhaust fan still in place, but I moved it to the top before testing and selling, as this change made a noticeable improvement in the temps. This i7 system is quite similar to the first build, maybe a slight step down, but both are well suited for 1080p low to medium settings in newer titles and should handle almost any esports or older game with ease. For game testing, I started with the Ryzen 5 build and ran Cyberpunk 2077 at native 1080p on medium settings. This setup delivered a fairly stable average of 60 FPS with only a bit of CPU headroom left. In Baldur's Gate 3 at native 1080p medium, however, the 3500X became more of a bottleneck in areas with lots of NPCs. Frame rates were generally stable and performance was smooth in the less demanding environments, but the system ended up averaging around 30 FPS in the most intense scenes. Overall, this is still a perfectly playable result in my opinion. Lastly, in Hogwarts Legacy at native 1080p with high settings and TAA set to high, the Ryzen 5 PC performed well, delivering anywhere from 50 to 80 FPS in most environments, with an average that typically stayed above 60 FPS. Switching to the i7 7700K PC, I tested Cyberpunk 2077 at the same 1080p native and medium settings. It averaged just a few frames less, which makes sense as the 1070 Ti is about 10 to 15% faster than the 1070 in most scenarios on paper. On this system, I also tested Starfield at 1080p with the medium preset and a 50% render resolution. In New Atlantis, some quick testing showed around 40 FPS in most areas. While it's not ideal, this environment is one of the most demanding in Starfield, so it's a near worst case scenario in terms of intensity. Lastly, I used the Blacksmith Wukong benchmarking tool with FSR set to 66% render resolution and low graphics settings. The benchmark averaged 70 FPS, which should translate to more than enough performance for smooth in-game experience. I listed both systems around the same time, and as expected, the Ryzen 5 system sold within a week for $400. The buyer was specifically interested in playing iRacing, and the recommended specs for that game match closely with this PC. As for the other system, it took about a week longer to sell, but I eventually managed to find another local buyer who offered me $380, which I happily accepted. As for some housekeeping, I sold the Ryzen 5 1600 for $35 and parted ways with the GTX 970 that I hadn't even used in the challenge, selling it for $50, which is still more than I originally paid for it. This brings us to a total of $1,222.36 in cash on hand for next time, where I plan to focus on building one last system. This final build will feature some more newer parts and should be a higher end system overall, but I'll share the details on that next time. Looking ahead, I'm definitely planning to restart this series in the future, flipping my way up again from just $100. If you'd like to stay tuned for that or any other budget PC content, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And if you have any suggestions, questions, or PC flipping stories of your own, feel free to drop a comment. Thanks for watching.